For more problems and videos like this for linear algebra, you can take a look at Sarai Studies. Link is in the description box below. You start with your leftmost non-zero column, that's this one right here. Your pivot position is at the top, and your goal is to always kill everything below it and make it 0. But I know this is a reduced row echelon form rule, that all of your leading entries should be 1, but it doesn't hurt to do it from the beginning because it actually helps you deal with your numbers easily. So let's make this a 1 and take care of that. So I would have to divide row 1 by -2 by the same thing. That's 1, this divided by -2, that's -3, this divided by -2, that is -2. So this is our new row 1, and every other row stays the same. So this is still my pivot position, and I still want to kill everything below it. So the first thing I see is this 3. I want to kill something that is in row 2. I want to use whatever's inside my pivot position to do so. My pivot position is in row 1. Then my equation becomes plus, and then whatever's here, that's row 2. To find out what I need to do to manipulate this equation so that this becomes 0, I write down these rows in order. Row 1 comes first, then row 2. Then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this first entry here to be 0. First entry in the row. So first entry should be 0. Then I focus on this column and I ask myself, what can I change so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, this would have to be a -3. How do I get this one to become a -3? I would have to multiply by -3. But whatever I do to one entry, I have to do to the rest of the entries in that same row, which is why we take the entire row and we say -3, row 1. Then this becomes -3, this becomes +9, this becomes 6. Then we add just like we said we were. 3 minus 3, 0, just like we wanted. This is 8, and then 6 plus 5 is 11. And this is my new row 2. So since the only thing I'm changing is row 2, these two rows should stay the same. My row 2 becomes new row 2. So now this is still our pivot position, and we managed to make everything below it 0. So then we can move on by crossing out the corresponding row and column of that pivot, and then focusing on the submatrix that was formed by doing so. And that's this one right here. And then you would repeat your steps with this matrix here. So literally pretend that this is what you were given in the first place, and then do the same thing again. So again, you start with your leftmost non-zero column, which is this one. Pivot position is at the top. Your goal is to kill everything below it, make it a 0. So I want to kill this 5. But remember, it's super useful if you actually make this a 1, because at the end of the day, to get it into reduced row echelon form, these have to be 1s anyway. So you might as well make them a 1 before you start killing stuff to make your work easier. So what do I need to do to this to have it be a 1? Just divide by 8, right? But whatever I do to one entry in the row, I have to do to the rest of them. So since this is row 2, I'm going to take the entirety of row 2 and divide by 8. So I'm going to just take this. The only row that's changing is row 2. So this divided by 8 is 1. This divided by 8 is 11 over 8. We have 0, 1, 11 over 8. Now this is still my pivot position, so I can continue killing everything below it. So I want to kill this 5. This 5 is in my row 3. I want to kill something that's in my row 3. I want to use whatever's inside my pivot position to do so. My pivot position is in row 2. And then my equation becomes plus, and then always whatever is here, row 3. And to find out how I can manipulate this so that this becomes 0, I'm going to write down these two rows over here. Then I'm adding because I'm adding. Then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this to become a 0. That's the first, second entry in a row. So first, second entry here should be 0. Then I focus on this column and I ask myself, what can I change so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, this would have to be a -5. How do I get this one to be a -5? I would have to multiply this one by -5. But whatever I do to one entry in a row, I have to do to the rest of them in that same row, which is why I take the entirety of row 2 and multiply by -5. That way I have -5 here, and then I have -55 over here, over 8. And then I can add, like I said I was. This is 0. This is 5 minus 5, 0, just like I wanted it to be. And then if you have this, this is over 1. Common denominator is 8. Here is 1, so -55 times 1. And here 8 times, so 6 times 8, that's 48. And this is going to give you -7 over 8. So this here is my new row 3. So since the only row I'm changing is row 3, then these two rows stay the same. And row 3 becomes my new row 3, which is this one. So this is still our pivot position, and we managed to kill everything below it. So we're done with that. Once we're done with the pivot, we cross row and column, and then we focus on the submatrix formed. When we do that, we start with the leftmost non-zero column. That's this one. Pivot position's at the top, so it's just that one. Tip is to make it a 1, so numbers are easier to work with. How do I make this a 1? Well, I would just multiply by 8 over 7 and a negative, so it can cancel out negative. I'll take row 3 and multiply by -8 over 7. So the top two rows stay the same, and then here these are still zeros, and this will just end up being a 1. So just cleaning things up a little bit, this is now still my pivot position, and there's nothing below to kill, so we're done. Now we work backwards, so up and then to the left. Now we want to kill everything above it. So the first thing to kill is 11 over 8. So I want to kill this 11 over 8, which is in row 2. I want to use whatever's inside my pivot position to do so. My pivot position that I'm working with is in row 3. And then my equation becomes plus whatever is here, row 2. To find out how I can manipulate this equation so that this becomes a 0, I write down these rows over here in order though. So not in the order of the equation, but in the order of how the rows are in the matrix. So row 2 comes before row 3. Then I'm adding because I said I was adding. Then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this to become a 0. So that's the first, second, third entry in a row. So first, second, third entry in a row should be 0. Then I focus on this column and I ask myself, what can I change so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, this would have to be negative 11 over 8. So how can I get this to be a negative 11 over 8? I would have to multiply by negative 11 over 8. But whatever I do to one entry, I have to do to the rest of them. So I have to take the entire row and multiply by negative 11 over 8. And it's really insignificant here. It only affects this. And then you just add like normal. 0 plus 0, 0. This is 1 and this is 0 just like we wanted it to be. And this is my new row 2. So since the only row I'm changing is row 2, then the first and the third rows stay the same. And then my row 2 becomes this new row 2 right here. So I'm still in this column using this pivot position. And the next thing I want to clear out or kill is this negative 2. So I want to kill something that is in row 1. I want to use whatever's inside my pivot position to do so. My pivot position is still in row 3. Then my equation becomes plus whatever is here, that's row 1. Row 1 comes before row 3. My goal is for this to be 0. That's the first, second, third entry in a row. So first, second, third entry in a row should be 0. Then I focus on this column only and I ask myself, how can I get it so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, this would have to be a 2. How can I get that one to be a 2? I would multiply by 2. But whatever I do to one entry, I have to do to the rest of them in that row. So I would take the entirety of row 3 and multiply by 2. So then this just becomes 2 and 0 times 2 is still 0. Then I can add like I was. 1 plus 0, that's 1. This is negative 3 and this is 2 minus 2, which is 0 just like we wanted it to be. Then this here is my new row 1. Since the only row I'm changing is row 1, these two rows stay the same and row 1 becomes my new row 1, which is this one right here. So this pivot has everything above it 0 as well, so we move on. Again, we cross out row and column corresponding to that pivot and we focus on the remaining submatrix formed, which is this one, and you repeat the steps. But this time the steps is focus on your pivots, which were these, and just make sure that everything above it is 0. So then the only thing I would have to kill is this negative 3 right here. So I want to kill something that is in row 1. I want to use whatever's inside my pivot position in that column, right, to do so. That's in row 2. Then my equation becomes plus whatever's here, that's row 1. To find out how I can manipulate the equation so that this becomes a 0, I'm going to write these rows down here in order. So row 1 comes before row 2. And then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this here to be 0. That's the first, second entry in a row. So first, second entry in a row should be 0. Then I focus on this column and I ask myself, what can I change so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, this would have to be a 3. So how do I get that one to be a 3? I would multiply by 3. But whatever I do to one entry, I have to do to the rest of them in that same row. So I take the entirety of row 2 and I multiply by 3. But it's really insignificant here. It stays 0. So this is the only really entry that changes. And then you just add. So this becomes 1. This is 0 just like we wanted it to be. And this is 0. And then this is my new row 1. So since the only row I change is row 1, these two rows should stay the same. And this row 1 is going to become my new row 1, which is this one. And so this is our pivot. We managed to make everything above it a 0. So then we cross out and then we focus on the remaining submatrix formed. This was still our pivot. There's nothing above it. So essentially we're done. This is already in reduced row echelon form. All of the pivots are 1s. Everything below it is 0. Everything above it is 0. And that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next.